Well, welcome tonight, and I truly hope you had an opportunity to enjoy this beautiful day we had today. I'm told that this is the last one for a while. The weather's changing, but that's okay. This is New York, and we are New Yorkers, and this is October, so it's all good. So tonight, before we move into the books we're going to look at, I had a couple of people approach me regarding our previous lessons. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that you guys are digging into this and finding things. And because, especially with this study, it is an overview, I'm just so encouraged that you guys are digging in deeper and picking up on things. One of the things that was brought to my attention was when we talked last week in the book of Joshua about him meeting the commander of the Lord's armies, right, in his camp before they went into battle. And again, remember, as we do this study, let this not be your only study of any of the books we're going to look at, okay? This is one lesson, commentary put together by, particular individuals, but look further, for all the books. Look further. Get as much as you can from as many different reputable perspectives as you can. And one of the things that was brought to my attention was that if you read more deeply into Joshua chapter 5, it gives us, you can pick up evidence that this is not just an angelic leader, but there's argument that this is actually a pre-incarnate vision of the Lord that came to Joshua. And if you go through there's specific points. And as we talked about Joshua being a new Moses, there's verses in there that support that. Okay, so, and we're not going to go back to it in a study form, but I encourage you to go back to it, Joshua chapter 5, and reread it, and then see what you think from actually delving into the verses. And then it was brought to my attention, oh dear, Peg, help me, what were we talking about? It was in the book of Numbers, but dealing with going into the promised land, and the particulars of the wording. As we talked about, was this a God-ordained act of genocide? Does it really say that? And as you read in Numbers, what chapter did you find it in? 33. Numbers chapter. Verse 50 all the way to the end. Numbers 33, verse 50 to the end of the book. It'll help and clarify for you the actual verses and the wording and the intent. And as we said earlier, again, I reiterate it. Read in the context. When you're reading a section, read the section before, read the section after. Look at all the things that relate to that particular topic to get your general conclusion of what the verses mean and what God's word to the people was and is. The book is eternal. Yeah. So thank you for digging into it on your own. Thank you for taking that level of interest in the study, and then for bringing it up and sharing it. Because whatever you share with me, in those regards, I will make sure I bring to the group so everybody can benefit and we can all move forward together. So, moving forward, tonight we're going to start with the second book of the prophet Samuel, and then we're going to look at an overview of the two books of Kings and finish with an overview of the two books of Chronicles. So let's start with the second book of Samuel. Marilyn?
The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and a blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prize soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister, Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, and it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has two poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life. And he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic King who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.
All right, the book of Samuel. In the first book of Samuel, we see the story of Saul, the first king. Second book of Samuel, we see the story of David, the king that succeeded Saul. And as we start with question 1, I want to draw your attention, if you haven't picked up on it already, to the way the creators of the Bible Project have structured each of these videos we've looked at. When they open up their introduction to a particular book, they focus a lot on how the book is organized. Okay, so I want you to consider that with the second book of Samuel. Question 1: what are the 3 movements, or they actually describe it as 2 movements and a conclusion, of the second book of Samuel as they are identified in the video? Anybody pick up on it? What are the 3 movements that break up this book?
Well, the first one is his successes and blessings.
Okay. We see David's success and blessing. You know, and as they say, we first see David in the book of 1 Samuel, definitely overshadowed by Saul, but we see this young man starting to rise in God's favor. So as we transition into the second book of Samuel, and David now becomes king, the first part of that is showing us his success, his faithfulness, and his blessing. What follows that? Tragedy in the form of his moral failure. We'll talk about more of that momentarily, but it's his success and blessing followed by his personal moral failure. And what is the conclusion at the end of the book? Where does it go? Hope, right? It brings us out of this human quagmire of his success and his blessing and then his downfall. It ends with hope. Hope in what? What does this book open up for us? Okay. I don't recall if this is the first place it's mentioned, but this is where it started to be focused and developed. The idea that there's going to be a future king, and what's significant? A king from what? The line of David. This is where we start to see the development of the idea that a future king is going to come from the bloodline of David. And if you are familiar at all with the Bible and moving into the New Testament, you know this is a crucial idea, a crucial theme. And we're seeing it identified and solidified here. We see something of David's character. What do we see in this book? As we transition out of the first book of Samuel into the second, we see something of his character before the moral failure. What do we see? How does he respond to the news that his nemesis, King Saul, is dead? Compassion. Does he throw a party? He grieves. A heartfelt compassion for the man who tried to kill him. And then later in the story, we'll see the same character trait again in regards to what part of the story? Say it again. His sons, and in particular one son, which attempted to overthrow him. Absalom. And made David again a fugitive, just like Saul did. And just like at the death of Saul, at the death of his son, he does not gloat, he does not raise a victory sign, he grieves. Question 2. What does King David accomplish for the people of Israel in this second book of Samuel? What do I identify as a major accomplishment for this king? He unites all the tribes in a way they had not been united before, even under the first king. He solidified the tribes of Israel as the nation of Israel. Joshua brought them into the land, and we saw them struggle through the period of the judges, and we saw them under a king, but not unified like they are now under David. It was very distinctive. It was very powerful. He is being attributed as the one who literally created the nation of Israel. Yes, he solidified them and unified them. And in this promised land, initially promised to Abraham and now occupied by the descendants of Abraham, where does he set up his government and his capital? In Jerusalem, which is in the southern part of the promised land, and that'll be significant by the time we're done with this look at 2 Samuel. He sets it up as Jerusalem, as his political capital. This is where he sets up his kingdom government. Okay? Jerusalem's a very interesting city. Why? What makes Jerusalem so notable? When was it founded? Well, we'll get to that. When was the city of Jerusalem, when was the cornerstone brick laid? Who knows? It comes out of the darkness of history. It's a city that was there before anybody could remember.
Right, it's supposed to be small and insignificant.
Small and insignificant. It was not known as Jerusalem. It was the city of a people group. Do you know what the people group was? The Jebusites. So, and I don't...
That's where Abraham sacrificed his son.
Does that is that tie with that? No. Okay, I'm not sure. I don't know. So there's a relationship in terms of the geography to the area where Abraham was told to sacrifice his son. You don't know a verse reference for that, do you, or where that could be found? That's okay. But the idea is this was an antiquated city. I mean, it says, and there's several in the Old Testament, but this one is most notable because it starts coming out of the obscurity of ancient history. But what makes it notable? How about God's hand is on it. It is still there, which again is not unique. But if we read further through the prophecies into the end times, what's still going to be there?
Jerusalem is still going to be there.
Jerusalem. And upon the city that's there, what is the kingdom of God that comes down to the earth known as? How does the scripture identify it? The New Jerusalem. So this idea of this city of Jerusalem comes out of historical obscurity. Is the final place.
It's the most important city in the world.
The most important city of the world because?
Because it's the place God established himself.
It's the place God established, and what? The temple is going to come, but something more significant is going to come from this place, Jerusalem, and we know it from our readings later on and into the New Testament, but what is it? Because I know a lot of you have been down that road. What is going to happen here that makes this city the most important city in the world? What happened there? Thank you. The crucifixion. This is where God brought his salvation plan for all humanity together. The city of Jerusalem and its outskirts. Oh, no. I'd never say that. I won't even say it for the camera. So Jerusalem, David makes it the capital city of the nation of Israel. And then it goes on to say in the video that he not only made it his political capital, he made it the religious capital. What did he do to make Jerusalem the religious capital of this people?
He brought the Ark of the Covenant.
He brought in the Ark of the Covenant and established it there. And as we move forward tonight, we're going to see the actual construction of a temple, a house of God in this city. Good, good. And the focus of all of these prominent things we're talking about, you'll find in 2 Samuel chapter 7. A specific place to look would be verses 8 through 16, because we see there David, with a good heart, a very well-intentioned heart, feeling bad that he lives in the luxury of a king. What does he feel bad about? What weighs on his conscience and on his heart?
That he has a home and that God does not have a home.
He has a home, and we're talking an upper home. God's still living in a tent. So he wants to build a house for God. A noble idea, right? What's the response? Thanks, but no thanks. And you can read the details of it there, but he said, thanks for no thanks. And God goes further and says, no, you're not going to build me a home. I'm going to build you a home. What's he talking about? A dynasty, a forever lineage. Which is kind of interesting because the history shows that the lineage of David lasts about 400 years and then peters out. So it leaves a little bit of a mystery for now. We'll get to that later in this study. But 2 Samuel 7 is where God declares he will build David a house, referencing a royal dynasty, a kingly dynasty. And this is God's prophetic promise to provide what? What kind of king? An eternal kingdom and an eternal king, a Messiah. What's Messiah mean? Savior. Savior. So we see something that's going to impact all of humanity coming out of this Israelite historical story, and it just tells us, it reaffirms for us that it's so much more than that. Okay? So God declares he's going to build a house for David. All right. And it just pretty much put an answer to question 3. I really wish you'd stop me before I do that. But. So that's question 3, is he's going to build a dynasty from the line of David. And then, just when everything's going well, sin, right? What is the cause? What is the focus of David's sin? Which one? Perfect answer. He may have been a man after God's own heart, but he was a man. And there was the woman next door. But before you get to the woman next door, what is prominent in David's falling? Does anybody remember? And I'm going, you would have had to have read this. You're not going to get it in the overview from the video, but it's significant. We want to look at this because he was such a great guy. And he was at the peak of everything. He was not where he was supposed to be. Because, and I'm paraphrasing, but the verses, say something to the effect of, in the time when kings went to war, when the kings were going to war, where's David? Staying home watching TV. He's where he's not supposed to be. And because he was not engaged in the business in which he was supposed to be engaged, he was susceptible, we'll say. And there's an opportunity. And you can read the details of the woman next door, Bathsheba. And he lusts, and then he acts on the lust. And the story's not really clear. I mean, it says he sends a servant to go tell her, come on over. Whether she was compelled because he was the king or was complicit in the sin. We really don't know, and it really doesn't matter from the focus of the gospel, the scriptures and what it's trying to tell us. But he goes from just one bad step and decision to another, to another, to another. All of a sudden, he's got a pregnant neighbor next door. And insult to injury, who's the husband of this woman? Uriah. Tell me something about Uriah.
I would call him a general.
Okay, he's a general. He's one of the leaders of David's army.
High-ranking man in the army.
Okay, a high-ranking man in David's army. A notable Israelite?
Yes.
No.
He was. David had high regard for him, and so did whoever it was.
I know what you're talking about. Within the army, David, is it Joab or Abner? I forget which one it was. But whoever was David's right-hand man, they highly respected Uriah. My question was he an Israelite? He was a Hittite. He was a foreigner. But of David, who later we're going to see regarded as a man after God's own heart, a man who has shown his faith in the first book of Samuel and up to this point in the second book of Samuel, who ends up showing a more godly disposition in this particular story? The foreigner, Uriah. The man of God falls down in his godly ways. What made Uriah such a more notable and commendable person? He was extremely loyal to David, to his troops. David tries to finagle things, bring them home so that it looks like the pregnant wife is the pregnant wife of the husband and not the king who was supposed to be not where he was. And he won't go for it. He has too much integrity, Uriah. And we see documented 2 or 3 times that David tries to connive something so that he can kind of slide out from underneath this shame, which he knows is going to come out as soon as she starts showing. And Uriah won't go for it. What does David ultimately descend? What kind of sin does he descend into? Murder. Conspiracy to murder. Because at this point, his only option is, this guy's got to die heroically in battle so I can quick marry her before anybody starts doing the math. But this is where the godly king descends into. Not all at once, but by little fault, followed by bigger fault and bigger and bigger. It becomes systemic in his life, is the point that we should all be guarding ourselves against. He ends up confronted by the prophet Nathan, and here's where it gets important. When confronted with his sin, called out on it by God through the prophet Nathan, what does David do that distinguishes himself from Saul when Saul was called out on his sins? What does David do? He repents. Saul made excuses. But. I had to do this. I had to do that. David, down on his face, admits it, repents. Repents before God. Okay? And what do we know of our God? How does God respond when a sinner repents? We're forgiven. Slate's wiped clean, right? So David's life goes on happily ever after, right? Ha! Wrong. Right, another lesson for us to pick up on. We sin, and I didn't say if we sin. We sin, and if we repent, God forgives us. But what remains? Payment, consequences. God will wipe our eternal slate clean from the sin. Boast about any sin I know of hurts somebody, and the consequences stay. And for David, you see it in this, family dysfunctional at a level even reality TV can't come up with, okay? I mean, it all comes apart. But he is still forgiven by God, and these are the things we should take out of the story of David.
I don't know how people find this Bible to be boring. So many stories
Exactly.
like this. It's so intriguing.
Exactly. To collectively say the Bible is a boring book, you haven't read it. Now, there's parts where I'll give you credit. And some of them, Leviticus is like, trying to get through that. But there are stories of such human drama, victory, tragedy, repentance, salvation. No, I don't know how you can consider it boring. Okay. Question 4. We get to the latter part of the book, chapters 22 and 23. David is writing poems. He's singing. He's at the latter part of his life. Okay? And his songs have certain themes to them, his poems or his songs. Okay? What were those themes? Do you remember? What does he sing about? God's faithfulness or God's grace. What else comes up as a major theme in his songs? God was everything to him, and God's covenant promises were everything to him. And the ultimate promise of a future king from his own bloodline. And they talk about David's poems at the end of 2 Samuel and comparing them to Hannah's poems at the beginning of 1 Samuel. Hannah was the mother of the prophet Samuel. What was the connection? And it's question 4. How do David's poems at the end of 2 Samuel relate to Hannah's poems at the beginning of 1 Samuel? What are the similarities? How do they relate to each other? And,
Well, her reliance on God.
Okay.
God, everything.
Okay. Hannah relies on God. David relies on God. What else? There's a very prominent theme which you can pull out of both David's songs and Hannah's song. Okay, they're both referring to God as the ultimate rock of salvation. All right, the one to turn to, the only one to turn to. What is lifted up and what is put down in terms of human behavior? Humility is lifted up. So, conversely, what is pulled down in both of these songs? Human pride, arrogance. Okay? And ultimately we see, and it comes up specifically in Hannah's, and it's reflected in David's, that God works despite human evil. Okay? The evil of Saul, and then even David's own evil, his sin, and back to Hannah, the evil of some of the priest characters that she had to contend with in her desire to have a child, and her inability to have a child, and her prayers to God to take her out of this barren state. And the way they sum it up in the video is that God uses ungodly people. God uses screwed up people to accomplish his will. But in using fallen, ungodly, screwed up people, do we take it that God condones their behavior? Does he ever condone or excuse the failings in us? He never does. He will forgive it. He will use us. But he never condones what keeps us away from the relationship with him. Any questions on that overview of 2 Samuel? Then let's look at an overview of the 2 books of the Kings. Marilyn? 1 and 2 Kings.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20, and then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch-nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
In our current Bible, 2 books of the Kings, and as Louise observed earlier, it's like these are 2 books in particular that there's no way you can read these and get bored. There is such human drama through these books. The first book of the Kings begins with Solomon. Begins with David. He's in his latter years. He's in his end days. He's preparing to turn the throne over to David, to his son Solomon. We see a lot of drama. We see David again on this deathbed in this conversation with his son, initially presenting himself as that godly man, but then what happens in that conversation? Oh, by the way, I've got some payback I want you to take care of for me. It sounds like a scene out of The Godfather. And they go through, and you can see from the second book of Samuel all these people that had betrayed David as the king when he was on the run, that didn't help him, all these different things. David's remembering all of these on his deathbed and telling the son he is about to have replace him as king, take care of this for me. So it goes from this godly transition of power to this human accounting for the sins against them. We just finished saying that what set David apart when he sinned is he did what? Before God. He repented and relied on God's forgiveness, did he not? Well, apparently he forgot that in this moment because he wants blood for blood, and Solomon does it. So Solomon becomes out of David's many wives and many children, and Solomon was not the one that would have been the firstborn and according to the rules of the time been the king. But Solomon becomes king. We see another, example scripturally of how God uses the unlikely. We saw it with, you go back to the birth of Jacob and Esau. Jacob ends up with the birthright and everything. Jacob was not the firstborn. And we can see other examples too of how God will use whom he will use, even if it's an unlikely choice by everything we would expect. Solomon starts out great. What is Solomon known for? His wisdom and his intelligence, because when he takes the throne, it tells us God asks him, what do you want me to do for you? What would you like? And apparently it was an open-ended question. And instead of asking for all the wealth of the world, Solomon asked for wisdom. And God credits him for this, right? And gives it to them. And because he did not exercise greed in what he wanted, he gave him the riches too. Another thing that he's known for. Building the temple. The temple that David wanted to build, God allowed Solomon to build. And it was apparently amazing. What Solomon did, entering his reign, with this gift of wisdom that God had given him, and the management of the city and the kingdom, and this temple he built to honor God, became legendary in his own time. People all around that known world knew about the kingdom of Israel and this King Solomon and the city and the temple to their God that he had built. And it gives us a story of a faraway queen, powerful in her own right. Remember the Queen of Sheba, that says, I got to see what this place is all about. And personally makes the journey to see the city, to see the temple, and to sit down and talk with this man Solomon. That's how great he was. Again, the apex of a promising career. But what happens? Oh, you just stop it now.
He wants to marry all the king's daughters for political alliances.
And 300 just for fun. 700 wives, 300 concubines, it tells us. Are you seeing a family problem here? Gentlemen, beware. Apparently the ladies can be troubling to us. At least it was for David and for his son. Their major downfall was in their lust and their desire for feminine company. We'll just leave it at that. So we see the wisdom, the rise, and just like his father, and then the downfall.
Well, it illustrates that knowing how to live or knowing what to do isn't necessarily the same as having the power and ability to do it.
Good observation. Knowing the right thing to do is not necessarily having the power and to do it.
Because God said, you are the wisest that ever lived and will ever live.
Yeah.
So he was the one.
His wisdom was again, never to be surpassed. But yet, he also fell into sin through his own lusts and his desires. Again, the scriptures will tell us he married 700 wives, and a prominent aspect of that is most of these were political marriages with surrounding kingdoms to solidify power. Okay? So, yeah, let me do it again. We just kind of answered question 5. What was Solomon's downfall? Yeah. Can I get an amen?
He also spent more time and effort building his own home more than the temple itself.
Ah, okay. So at some point his focus kind of shifts, and he starts to spruce up his own digs. And again, falling prey to the wealth and prosperity that was there. You know, at some point you have the wealth, but you got to be careful that at some point the wealth doesn't have you. And he fell into that, and it was his downfall. Good. So his reign comes to an end in chapter, I think it's 12. We see Solomon's son about to take the kingship. And what happens here?
Rehoboam was not a good man.
Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, made some bad choices, was not a good man. And we see, as you read that part, you can read into it as to what was really going on behind the scenes by the time Solomon's reign had come to an end. You know, we see this great prosperity, the prosperity of the city and everything, but all of a sudden you can see that it was accomplished on the backs of the common people who were taxed almost to their limit.
Well, Solomon was in a way falling in the same pits as David. They were not good fathers.
Okay. We see him following in the footsteps of his father, David, in that they were not good fathers. They did not take that responsibility for family to heart as they should have, and it cost both of them. And in this case, it cost the nation of Israel. Because when Rehoboam comes up, the people approach him and say, look, your father taxed us to the breaking point. Give us a break. And it says that he had two groups of advisors. One was older, and I'm guessing probably inherited from his father Solomon. And those advisors say to Rehoboam, give him a break. Give him a break. And then he has some younger advisors. It sounds like they were peers to this man and everything. And what do they say? Squeeze them harder. There's more they can give. And he follows them. And what's the outcome?
Disaster.
Disaster in the form of what?
Division of the kingdom.
We-
Division of Israel.
We see the division of the nation of Israel. We see a civil revolt and a separation. As we said, this kingdom of David, established with its government in the south, in Jerusalem, of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of them rebel and say, we will not follow the house of David anymore. And they leave. They leave, and they establish their own kingdom in the north, a different capital, a different identity in Samaria, a different place of worship, because they aren't going down to that Jerusalem where those other people are. They built their own temple, but what was the greatest problem with that? It was distant from God's presence, represented by the temple, the Ark of the Covenant. Did they stay faithful to God's covenant? No. They ended up instituting idol worship and blending the faith they had started with. And now you've got, yeah, Gordy.
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just thinking the big difference between David and Solomon. David grew up a poor shepherd kid.
Ah,
He developed a knowledge, a personal knowledge and relationship with God while he was out alone with the sheep
Good.
taking care of him. Enough that it gave him confidence to face Goliath because he knew God was with him. And there's no indication that Solomon, who grew up as a rich kid,
right.
had any of that as far as his relationship with God was concerned. I mean, he did humble
That's
himself
good.
and ask for wisdom, but
Right.
he didn't seem to really have the aspects of a believer.
Good, good, good. So the observation, a major difference between David and his son Solomon was that David started with humble beginnings. Started poor, started in the fields, started working. And Solomon grew up in the lap of luxury and didn't know any of those qualities that David acquired that allowed him to face a giant and to have a very sincere faith. Solomon never had that humility. He had the wisdom to ask for wisdom, but that was about it.
He must have had some kind of relationship with God because God came and talked to him,
He,
asked him what he wanted.
he must have had some relationship with God, yes, because God came to him and asked him. Now the question was that because of the merits of Solomon or the plan of God?
Plan of God.
I'm thinking you got to go with plan of God. As we see the life of Solomon unfold, and then what he passes on to his son, to the point where now you've got the nation of God, God's people, divided, contentious with themselves, and now you see the term Israel being taken and used by that northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom becomes the kingdom of Judah.
I'm sorry, I lost my thought.
Let me know when it comes back. I know how that goes.
I was just thinking that perhaps David, knowing he might not have been wanting to get even with these guys that he told Solomon to kill.
Okay.
He knew that he could control them. He might not have had the confidence that Solomon could.
Okay.
He might have been afraid that they would try to rise up against
Usurp the power.
from the get-go, get rid of these guys.
Okay, yeah, that could very well be. When we go back to David giving Solomon the instructions to kill David's enemies, maybe that wasn't so much a vindictive thing. Maybe the observation being made that maybe David knew that he could handle them, and maybe he didn't have any confidence Solomon could. It's something to consider. We don't know. So good questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
Could it be they're teaching us? And the teaching is, later in the book, everything is to let us know that he is God.
Could it be that in this story, this is teaching us? Well, that's a great question and observation, because we should be confident that through this story, God is trying to teach us something. Well, we should take that for this entire Bible and keep that in mind, because yes, through this, we should be learning from the victories and, more importantly, the failures of the people that are documented in this story of God. Good, 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 good. So in this book, one of the things we see is a criteria established for evaluating the reign of each king in both the southern and the northern kingdoms. Question 6. What criteria do they identify in the video? What criteria is used to evaluate the reign of each king? Because these two books of the Kings will go king after king after king. Northern kingdom, southern kingdom, tell you where the kingdoms, the reigns overlap, tell you the good points, tell you the bad points. What is the criteria for evaluating the kings that come out of this? Anybody pick up on it? Okay. Did they worship, and here this is focusing on they as an individual and a leader of the people. Did they worship the God of Israel by himself, or do they worship idols, or somehow blend their faith? Exactly, very few do. So do they worship it? What was another criteria that was raised in here? Do they remain faithful to the covenant like David did, or do they give in to, and in saying like David did, over the scope of his life, because he had his falling moments, but do they end up being faithful, or do they become corrupt? And there was one more. Not only regarding their own personal worship, but what else? We got that one. Did they worship the God of Israel? But as king, as leader of these people, did they do what? How did they deal with the straying of the people? Did they tolerate their corruption and their idolatry? Did they tolerate it, or did they deal with it? So those are the criteria. And what do they say? The two books of the Kings give us 20 kings in each kingdom. And what's the scorecard for the northern kingdom? How many good kings by this criteria? 0. And the southern kingdom?
Well, they said 8, but when you look at the Bible,
Okay.
it actually says of the 8, only 4 were 100% for God.
Okay.
They say some were good, some were bad.
Okay. So in the video, it tells us 8 from the southern kingdom by this criteria were good kings. But if you read into the verses, you'll see they'll actually clarify that down to 4 that truly were faithful to the God of Israel. Not only in their personal lives, but as the leader of the people. There's an important role in leadership. And they were being evaluated by that. Go ahead. In the books of the Kings, it not only talks about the kings, it talks about prophets. So look at question 7. What was the role of the prophets during these times of the kings?
Wisdom and guidance for the king.
Wisdom and guidance for the king. In what specific way? They were to be the mouthpieces for God. They were supposed to speak to the king and the people the words of God. God spoke to the people through the prophets. What else were they supposed to do specifically? Yes. They were to be the watchdogs of God's covenant with this people. Okay? And there were prophets in the north and in the southern kingdom. Okay? They were to be the watchdogs, and part of that was to call out the king or the people when there was idolatry, when there was injustice. They were to challenge the people of the kingdom and the leaders of the kingdom to repent and follow their God, follow the Torah. Okay? And something else, something which as Christians and with our focus in the New Testament is very important for us to keep in mind. They were to remind the people that they were to be what? A light to the unbelieving, the Gentile nations. We often focus on our role as Christians, and we should, on the Great Commission that we come out. It's expressed in at the end of 2 of the 4 Gospels of what we're to do with this salvation and this knowledge we have. But it's not new. It's not a novel thing that came out of the cross. It's not for us only. From the beginning, the people of God who had the original covenant and these scriptures were to be a light to the other nations around them. It was never to be an exclusive club. They were to be witnessing in this promised land to the contentious neighbors they had. And the prophet's job was to call them out on that. Okay. As we get through this, the second book of the Kings, we see first the northern kingdom's failure. They are overtaken by a rising superpower in the region, the Assyrian nation, which attacks and overruns the northern kingdom. And this occurs around 722 BC, and that kingdom is gone. Those people are scattered. You can read, as you read through the texts, the verses dealing with the Assyrians, and absolutely brutal people. And what plays out later when we get to the Gospels, and historically, again, 700 years later, when we see Christ going into the land of who? Who were the people between Jerusalem and Galilee? Gospel of John tells us the Lord had to go through what? Samaria. One of the things the Assyrians did when they destroyed this northern kingdom, one of their tactics was they would take of the various peoples that they would conquer and dominate, they would force the intermixing and intermarriage of the different people groups. So they would take some of the Israelites from here, move them out there, move these people here, these people there, because once they eliminated the individual identity groups, they eliminated the threat of people rebelling against them. And that strategy led, at the time of Christ, to what was the nation of the Samaritans. And why? And it tells you why the Jews, who would have been the result of those southern kingdom, why they so resented the Samaritans in Christ's day. It comes back to here. The northern kingdom destroyed. The second book of Kings, chapters 22 and 23, tell an interesting story of one of the kings of the southern kingdom, King Josiah. It says he found the lost book of the law. What is significant about that? It's their constitution. You read between the lines, what does it mean? What does it tell us about this southern kingdom? They had lost their law. And apparently nobody was concerned because they went all this time, whatever time it was, without exercising the covenant of God. He finds the book of the law, which means somewhere along the line they'd lost the law of God. That's how corrupt and far from God they had gotten. And then we know 586 BC, the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonians. We see it in 2 Kings chapter 25. But the message for us to take away from there and the books of the Kings is God does not abandon his people, his promises, or the lineage of David. And as we read further into the Old Testament, we'll see how that comes together, that God remains faithful. Let's look at the final video, 1 and 2 Chronicles. Marilyn?
The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While they're two separate books in our Bibles, that division is not original. Due to scroll length, the book was divided in two, but it was written as one book with one coherent storyline. Now, in our English Bibles, Chronicles comes after the books of Samuel and Kings, and most of Chronicles is actually repeat content from those books. And so most modern readers, when they come to Chronicles, they think, wait a minute, I just read all of this, and so they skip it. And that's a shame, because this book is really unique and important in the Bible. In the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book, because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. The first word in the book is Adam, the first character at the beginning of the story, and then the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. Now, we don't know who wrote this book, but we can tell from details within it, it was produced by somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, for this author, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt some time ago, and as we learned from Ezra and Nehemiah, things were not going well. The great prophetic hope was that the city and the temple would be rebuilt, that God would come to live among his people, the Messianic king would come, and all the nations would come live under his peaceful rule, and none of that has happened. And so the author of Chronicles has reshaped these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future. And we'll see that he's designed this book to emphasize two clear themes. First, the hope of the coming Messianic king, and second, the hope for a new temple. Let's just dive in and you'll see these themes all over the book. First Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names. And you'll read these and think that this is kind of boring, and that may be true for you, but actually they're very, very important. The author is summarizing here the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming all of the key characters in the stories. And as he does so, he shapes the genealogies to emphasize two key lineages. First is the line of the promised Messianic king. So lots of space is dedicated to tracing the line of Judah that led all the way to King David, to whom the Messianic promise was given. And then from David, the author traces that line up into his own day. The other family line that receives lots of attention here is that of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron, who, of course, served in the temple. And so right from the start, you can see the two main themes: the author's hope of the Messiah coming to build a new temple, and it's rooted in these ancient genealogies. Now, after that, the author moves into the stories about David, and most of these are going to be familiar to you from the book of Samuel, but again, there's some really important differences. So first of all, the author leaves out all of the negative stories about David, where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So Saul chasing David around the desert and persecuting him, the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband, all of that is gone. And what's left are the stories that portray David as a good guy. And not only that, there's also new additional material that you won't find in the book of Samuel that shows David in a very positive light. So there's a large block of chapters where David makes preparations for the temple. He arranges resources and builders and Levites and choirs. And not only that, the author also portrays David as a Moses-like figure. God gives David plans for building the temple just as he gave plans to Moses for building the tabernacle. So why all this new material about David? The author's not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anybody can go read about them in the book of Samuel. Rather, he's trying to portray David as the ideal king in order to make him an image or a type of the future Messiah from the line of David. It's very similar to how Jeremiah or Ezekiel spoke of the coming Messiah as a new David. This is most clear in how the author retells the story of God's covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17. When you compare this story with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7, you'll see that the author of Chronicles is highlighting that neither David, nor Solomon, nor any of the kings from his line were the Messianic king, and that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. And so for this author, these stories about David from the past are what sustain his hope for the future. After David dies, we move into 2 Chronicles, which focuses on the kings that lived in Jerusalem. And again, there's lots of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, but there are many key differences. So the author has left out all of the stories about the kings of northern Israel, so he can just focus on the line of David. And there's lots of new material about these kings from David's line. He highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and he adds new stories about how their obedience led to success and God's blessing. But he also adds new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God. They didn't follow the Torah, they led Israel to worship idols, and these kings face horrible consequences, all leading up to Israel's exile, a mess of their own making. And so this whole section becomes a series of character studies where the author wants later generations of Israelites to learn from their family history, and so become faithful to their God and the Torah. Now, the book's conclusion is really unique too. At the very end of the book, the king of the Persians is named Cyrus, and he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And he says, last line of the book, "Whoever there is among you, of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." And that's how the book ends, with an incomplete sentence. Now, of course, the author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, but clearly in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. And so this incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. And so the book of Chronicles, it's the final book of the Jewish scriptures. It ends by pointing forward. It calls God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become the source of hope for the future. So Chronicles concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending, and that's what this book is all about.
We started this class and I got through the second book of Samuel. I got through it sooner than I expected, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, how am I going to finish out this class? I'm not going to have enough material, and now I have minutes. So let's take a quick look at this book of Chronicles. before we have to wrap it up. Fully transparent, I was one of the guys that they talk about that after reading the books of Kings, delved into the book of Chronicles and saying, I'm reading the same thing all over again. What's this all about? So let's look at what the differences are. Question 8, how do the books of Chronicles differ from the books of the Kings? What did you pick up from this study that they're not just verbatim books? What's the difference? Say it again. There's quite the public relations spin in this book of Chronicles. It focuses on David and it leaves out all the bad stuff. What's that all about? There was a good reason. We need to understand it. Why?
Well, you said it was already spoken about earlier. We don't need to rehash that. Let's move forward.
Okay. It's an acknowledgement that it was already spoken about. They're not trying to hide it. They acknowledge it. Let's not rehash it. Let's move forward. But they're moving forward with a particular purpose. What is the purpose for just focusing on the positive stuff of David?
They wanted us to look at David as the messianic king would be very similar to him.
Good.
They wanted to show him
Good.
on his good side.
This is a focused writing to present David as the type of that future messianic king that was going to come from his line. There's a specific literary purpose to doing this. And they not only focus just on David's good things, they don't even talk about the northern kingdom. Everything is focused to the kings of the southern kingdom. Why? Because they were the ones that were the line of David. Okay?
And the hope of the future
Yes.
to lead into the messianic king.
And the whole purpose is to point to the future, the hope of the future. Good, good. An interesting note that I didn't know before looking at it here. In our Bibles, as you know, the Protestant Christian Bible, the books of Chronicles come right after the books of Kings. Not so in the original Jewish Tanakh, their organization of these scriptures, their Bible. In that book, the two books of the Chronicles, or what was originally the one book of the Chronicles, is the last book of their Bible. So that helps us understand what they're trying to do with the books of Chronicles, because it's going back over not just David, but the history of the Jewish experience as the people of God. Okay? And that brings us to question 9, because 1 Chronicles opens with a genealogy that is 9 chapters long. Why? Because of what we're just saying here. They're looking back and they're tying the whole Jewish experience up to this time of the kings and then projecting forward to that messianic king. So we can summarize the Chronicles. The writer is looking back in history, looking at the heritage of the people, specifically in order to look forward to the future hope. So that's what Chronicles does that the books of Kings, does not. And that chronology emphasizes 2 specific lineages. What are they? Okay. So the first, as we've already said, is the lineage of David. But the second is the lineage of the priests, or Aaron. Why is that here? Well, because we know Jesus, as we go into the New Testament, is going to be our high priest.
Aren't those the only 2 tribes that are in southern?
Well, are they the tribes?
Judah, isn't that where David's from, Judah and Leviticus?
What are the 2 tribes that remained faithful? One was Judah, and no. In that civil split, 10 went north, 2 stayed south. One of them you've identified as Judah. What was the other tribe that stayed south? Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin are the ones that stay loyal to the line of David and Jerusalem.
Dan isn't even mentioned in the book of Revelation now.
Dan gets a bad rap. Dan, I used to say, oh, I'm named after one of the tribes. Well, that's not the tribe you want to be named after. So we're just kind of sweeping that away. Now, Dan, the tribe of Dan doesn't do very well. Yeah, where was I going with this? But again, why the lineage of the Levitical, the priesthood of Aaron? Because that's not where Christ comes from. Why is it significant that they follow the lineage and the genealogy of Aaron in the beginning of Chronicles? Because they're going to need a priest, and the line of priests, because they can't deviate from the law, so they are tracking the lineage. Remember what they said about when this was written, okay? It was written about 200 years after the Babylonian captivity. So when the author sat down to write the book of Chronicles, he's looking back 200 years on not only the exile of his people, but the return of his people. The city was being rebuilt, had been rebuilt. They were worshiping, but was everything the way the promises had led people to look for? Were the promises being fulfilled regarding the temple and the city and everything? No. So again, this lineage of the Levitical priests becomes crucial to the Jewish nation in the anticipation of needing that priesthood. Now, we know that the priesthood, between this time and our New Testament, the temple is rebuilt, the priests are doing their priest stuff, but is the hope been fulfilled yet?
No.
Is the hope fulfilled now? No. Temple's buried right now. And because of our current politics in that region, world politics, it can't be rebuilt. The Jewish people of this old covenant, this first covenant, are still waiting to implement their temple and their sacrifice with their priests. And to this day, those priests have to be from the Levitical line of Aaron. So it opens with that genealogy because it's so crucial to their faith and their hope. And their hope.
Does that mean they're still tracking?
They still attempt to. I have no idea how well that works these days in our contemporary Jewish culture. But when that temple comes back, there have to be priests from that Aaronic line. Okay? And we even see at one point in the rebuilding of the temple in the Old Testament that they were struggling with this. And as they were trying to recruit and put together their core of priests, they had some people that said, hey, we're from the line of Aaron, and they were going to be priests, and it was like, now, hold on, because it couldn't be verified. They weren't registered. So this genealogy, which will, well, if you're anything like me, tear you apart trying to stay in the reading of those 9 chapters, is crucial to the Jewish people in what they are looking for the fulfillment of their of God's promises to them. It is crucial. So we see the genealogy covers the messianic, or the line of David leading to a messianic king, and the line of the priests leading to the fulfillment of the prophecies about the temple and the worship. Let's see. We see, David being compared to Moses. You can find it in 1 Chronicles 28, verses 11 through 19. We see him preparing for the temple to be rebuilt, 1 Chronicles chapters 22 through 29. And we see David portrayed with the emphasis being on the messianic king to come from his line. And then how does the second book of Chronicles end? Good. No.
They put an exclamation point, but in
Okay.
the original script, there was no punctuation, so.
Right, there was no punctuation. So in this study, was it John and Tim, our narrators and the creators of this, put the study together. They say that the second book of Chronicles ends literally with a cliffhanger, an unfinished sentence. I'm not sure what translation you're looking at. Mine, the NIV, does not. It's punctuated as a complete sentence, but a sentence that is certainly looking to a future promise. And that's the important thing to say. Whether it was originally intended as an incomplete sentence, the epitome of cliffhangers, or it's an incomplete time of their faith, looking forward to the completion, it's the idea that they're looking forward that we need to take away. They're looking forward. They're looking backwards in these books of Chronicles in order to look forward and point forward, looking, searching for the ending, being the fulfillment of God's promises in the Old Covenant law. Not bad. Closing thoughts? Comments? Next week. And whereas I had said in the original Jewish organization of the books, the Chronicles are the last books, I'm presenting this class as closely as I can, and that'll become clear in a couple of classes. I'm presenting it in the order of our Bibles, okay? Because that's what we're working from. So I'm presenting the books in the order of our Bible. And so the next books we're going to look at are the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So that's what we'll look at next week. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you. Thank you for the word you give us. Thank you for the hope it gives to your people then and now, the hope that we have. Comes out of these old covenant writings because you're there. This is the foundation of the salvation you've completed for us, for all mankind. May we look joyfully ahead by studying diligently the words of your scriptures for their ancient meanings and the meanings they hold for us today. May we take you in our heart and walk out of here as good and faithful servants to you. In the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. That's it. Good night.